The midday sun was merciless, beating down on the open training range where a group of Navy SEAL officers stood with their arms crossed, their eyes locked on a distant target almost invisible against the jagged rocks beyond the desert floor. Dust shimmered in the heat, and the air carried the smell of gun oil, sweat, and pride. They had been drilling for hours, pushing their limits, testing their accuracy with rifles that could pierce steel at incredible distances. But today was different. Today, one of the commanders had set up an almost impossible challenge. At the edge of the horizon, nearly a mile away, a small piece of metal no larger than a hand mirror had been mounted against the rock. The order was simple: hit it. Not graze it, not come close, but hit it dead on. One by one the men had tried. Some had adjusted their scopes, recalibrated their breath, squeezed the trigger with surgical control. The crack of rifles echoed against the desert walls, bullets slicing through hot air. But each attempt ended the same way: dust clouds blooming inches away, ricochets sparking uselessly off the stone. The mirror glinted in the sunlight, mocking them, untouched and pristine. Frustration grew like a storm among the elite soldiers who were used to succeeding in everything they touched. They were warriors, the best of the best, and yet this target made them look clumsy, almost human. When the last shot went wide, one of the younger SEALs spat into the dirt, muttering curses. Another threw his hands up in defeat, while the officer in charge, Commander Briggs, a broad-shouldered man with a jaw like granite, let out a derisive laugh. He turned to his men and barked, "No one can hit that. Not at this distance, not in this wind. That's not just a target, it's a joke. And I don't care if God himself comes down with a rifle, it's not happening." His words carried weight, not only because of his rank but because of the iron certainty in his voice. If Briggs declared something impossible, it was carved in stone. But then from the side of the range, a quiet voice drifted into the air. "I could hit it." Heads turned, brows furrowed. Standing just beyond the perimeter was a woman, plain in appearance, her hair tied back in a messy braid, her clothes simple and dusty as though she had walked straight out of a nearby farm. No uniform. No weapon strapped to her back. No medals to speak for her. She looked so out of place among the hardened warriors that for a moment the SEALs simply stared in disbelief before laughter erupted. One of them nearly doubled over, holding his stomach. Another shook his head and muttered, "This is rich." Briggs squinted at her, sizing her up. "What did you just say?" "I said," she repeated, her tone calm, unwavering, "I could hit it." The laughter grew louder. A couple of the men clapped sarcastically, egging her on as if she were a child claiming she could lift a truck. But the woman didn't flinch. She didn't even smile. Her gaze was steady, focused, as though the target in the distance wasn't a speck of metal but something she had been watching for hours. The mocking died down slightly when Briggs took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. He towered over her, his shadow stretching across the ground like a threat. "You realize what you're saying, right? My men are the most trained marksmen in the world. They've spent years perfecting this. And you," he gestured up and down at her modest frame, "you think you can walk in here and do what they can't?" "Yes," she said simply. No hesitation. No apology. The silence that followed was sharp, broken only by the distant hiss of the desert wind. Something about the way she stood there, so ordinary yet so certain, gnawed at the men's pride. Briggs could have dismissed her, ordered her off the range, but there was something almost infuriating about her confidence. He could feel the eyes of his team on him, waiting to see if he would crush her arrogance or call her bluff. And Briggs, never one to back down from a challenge, decided to entertain the absurdity. "Fine," he growled. "You want to try? You'll try. But when you fail, and you will fail, you'll walk away and never waste our time again." She nodded, unbothered. One of the SEALs, still smirking, handed her a rifle, more as a joke than anything else. The weapon looked oversized in her hands, the weight of it something that would make most civilians uncomfortable. But she didn't fumble, didn't hesitate. She adjusted her stance with practiced ease, resting the butt of the rifle against her shoulder as though it belonged there. The laughter faltered. Some of the men exchanged puzzled glances. She didn't rush. She didn't look around for approval. Instead, she closed one eye, steadied her breath, and let the desert noise fade away. The world shrank to a single point, the gleam of that tiny mirror in the distance. Briggs crossed his arms, his scoff sharp. "No one can hit that," he muttered again, almost to reassure himself. The woman's finger tightened on the trigger. And the world held its breath. The rifle's crack tore through the desert air, a sharp thunderclap that echoed against the rock faces and silenced every whisper of mockery in an instant. The men's eyes tracked instinctively to the horizon, to the distant glint of the mirror that had defied every shot fired that morning. For a heartbeat there was nothing. Just dust hanging in the shimmering heat. Then, ping. The mirror shattered into sparkling fragments, scattering sunlight like a miniature explosion of diamonds across the rocks. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion could have been. A dozen pairs of eyes stared, wide and unbelieving, their jaws slack as though someone had just rewritten the laws of physics in front of them. The impossible had been undone in a single, steady pull of the trigger. She lowered the rifle with the same calmness she had carried from the start, as if she had merely plucked an apple from a tree rather than embarrassed an entire SEAL team in their own domain. Briggs' face was stone, but inside his chest, a storm was raging. He replayed what he had just seen, searching for an explanation. What? A fluke? No, he had watched her posture, the control of her breath, the precision in her trigger squeeze. That was not luck. That was skill. Skill so refined that it made his men look like rookies fumbling with toys. His pride bristled like a wounded beast, but his eyes betrayed something else too, reluctant respect, edged with suspicion. Do it again, he barked. The woman didn't argue. She simply reached for another rifle cartridge, slid it into place with practiced hands and repositioned herself. The range officer, still stunned, hurried to set up a second target. A tin plate hung precariously from a wire even farther than the first, its surface swaying in the wind. The men watched with a mixture of dread and anticipation, secretly hoping she would miss, desperate for their world to tilt back into something that made sense. Again she took her time. Her breathing slowed, her body relaxed, her focus narrowed to a point invisible to anyone else. When the shot rang out, there was no hesitation in her form, no flinch. A half-second later, the plate spun violently as the bullet struck it dead center, the metallic clang carrying across the range like a taunt. Gasps, curses, disbelief rippled through the SEALs. One of them muttered, "No way," while another rubbed his eyes as if clearing a trick of the heat mirage. The woman straightened, handed the rifle back with calm finality, and stepped aside as though the matter was settled. "Who are you?" Briggs demanded, his voice more growl than question. Her eyes flicked to him, steady as before. "Just someone who knows how to shoot." The simplicity of the answer only deepened the mystery. Briggs had spent years commanding men who prided themselves on their marksmanship, and here was a stranger who walked out of nowhere, shattered his certainty, and dismissed it as nothing more than knowing how to shoot. He could feel the morale of his men slipping, their egos bruised, their eyes no longer filled with absolute confidence in his words. That was dangerous, dangerous for unity, dangerous for authority. So Briggs doubled down. "No, that's not enough. You don't just walk in here and show us up without explanation." He stepped closer, his presence looming. "You're not some farmer's wife with lucky aim. Where did you learn that? Military? Special unit? Who trained you?" The woman tilted her head, a faint hint of amusement tugging at the corner of her lips. "I grew up in the mountains," she said at last, "where hitting something meant eating and missing meant going hungry. When the winters are long and the wolves circle your camp at night, you learn not to miss." The range fell silent again, but this time with a different kind of weight. Her words carried the truth of a life none of them had lived. It wasn't the discipline of a classroom or the drills of a barracks, it was survival, raw and unforgiving. Suddenly, her calm, her certainty, her unshakable precision made sense. She hadn't been trained by men like them. She had been trained by necessity, by the relentless hand of nature itself. For a moment, even Briggs couldn't find words. His men exchanged glances, some filled with respect, others with unease. She had proven herself twice over, and her explanation rang with a simplicity that no medal or rank could compete with. But Briggs' pride wasn't ready to yield. His jaw tightened, his hand balling into a fist at his side. "Hitting a target is one thing," he snapped, his tone sharp with challenge. "But combat is another. You think you could stand where my men stand? You think a steady trigger finger makes you one of us?" The woman's gaze didn't falter. "I don't need to be one of you," she said evenly. "I only need to do what you said no one could." Her words struck harder than any bullet, a truth so blunt that even the desert wind seemed to pause. Briggs' men looked at him, waiting to see how he would claw back authority, how he would turn this unexpected humiliation into another test of dominance. Briggs stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Then maybe it's time we find out just how much you really know." The tension on the range thickened, wrapping around the men like a vice. Commander Briggs' words weren't idle. When he challenged someone, it meant consequences. His team knew it, and the woman standing before him seemed to know it too, though she showed no fear. If anything, her calmness only sharpened the sting of his pride. The men shifted uneasily, the echo of her perfect shots still hanging in the air like a ghost none of them could shake. Briggs had to act. If he let her walk away now, it would mean acknowledging that she had embarrassed the most elite warriors in the world without breaking a sweat. That couldn't happen, not under his command. "Bring the obstacle," Briggs ordered, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. The younger SEALs moved with uncertain energy, pulling together a makeshift challenge they had used to break cocky recruits. Wooden targets were set at unpredictable angles, some hidden behind barriers, others rigged to swing in erratic arcs once triggered. The course was designed to simulate combat chaos. Targets appeared and vanished, distances varied wildly, and wind gusts could throw off even the most seasoned sniper. Few men hit more than half the targets on their first run. And Briggs intended for this so-called simple woman to miss. "You want to prove yourself?" Briggs said, motioning toward the obstacle course. "Then run this. If you're as good as you think, you'll clear it. But if you're not," his eyes narrowed, "you'll be exposed for what you are, a lucky amateur who got in over her head." The men murmured, their eyes darting between Briggs and the woman. A part of them wanted her to fail, to restore the order of things. Another part, though, gnawed with curiosity. What if she didn't? The woman walked toward the course without hesitation. She accepted the rifle one of the men handed her, checked its chamber with the ease of someone who had done it thousands of times, and nodded once. She didn't look at Briggs. She didn't look at the men watching. She looked only at the first target, her expression unreadable. Briggs gave the order. "Begin." The course came alive in a sudden storm of movement. A target snapped up on the far right, no more than a flash of wood painted with a crude face. Crack. The bullet struck it before some of the SEALs even registered its appearance. Another swung down from above, its pendulum arc unpredictable. Crack. Splinters flew. Then two more popped up in different corners, one near, one far. Crack. Crack. Both fell in the span of a breath. The men leaned forward, disbelief spreading through their ranks. She wasn't just hitting them, she was hitting them faster than most of them could track. Every shot came with the same calm precision, no wasted movement, no hesitation. The rifle seemed less like a weapon in her hands and more like an extension of her body. Targets came faster now, their rhythm meant to overwhelm, to force panic. She didn't panic. She flowed. A faraway target at an awkward angle, down. A swinging one half hidden by a barrier, down. One that popped up for barely a second before vanishing, down. She hit them all, one after another, her rhythm unbroken, her breathing steady as though she were simply strolling through a field rather than dismantling a course designed to crush egos. By the time the last target dropped, the desert range was silent again. Smoke drifted lazily from the barrel of her rifle. The course, notorious for humbling hardened soldiers, lay utterly conquered. No one laughed this time. No one dared. The woman lowered her weapon and finally turned back toward the men. Her expression hadn't changed, calm, almost detached. It was as though she had expected nothing less from herself, as though the impossible was simply ordinary to her. That calmness made her victory sting even more. Briggs' jaw worked as though chewing on gravel. His men stared at him now, waiting for his reaction. Their commander had declared her skill a joke, but jokes didn't obliterate an obstacle course on their first attempt. His authority trembled on the edge of collapse, and he knew it. "You think this proves something?" Briggs growled, forcing steel into his tone. "This is still a range. Targets don't shoot back. You've shown accuracy, yes. But accuracy without pressure is meaningless." "She didn't look like she was under no pressure, sir," one of the younger SEALs muttered before realizing the words had slipped out. Briggs' glare shut him up instantly, but the thought was already planted in the team's minds. She hadn't just performed, she had performed better than them under the weight of their doubt and mockery. That kind of pressure was no less brutal than combat in its own way. The woman met Briggs' glare evenly. "You keep raising the bar," she said softly. "And every time you expect me to fail. But what you don't understand is, I don't see a bar at all. I just see the target. And I don't miss." The word struck harder than any bullet. Briggs clenched his fists, fury burning beneath his skin. He was commander here. He was supposed to be the immovable mountain his men looked up to, not the one being overshadowed. Yet the harder he pushed her, the more she proved him wrong. And the worst part? His men were beginning to look at her with something dangerously close to admiration. Briggs felt the shift in the air like a crack in a foundation, subtle but dangerous. His men weren't supposed to look at anyone the way they were looking at her now. Admiration belonged to him, respect belonged to him, and doubt had no place in his command. Yet here stood a woman who had walked into their world uninvited, shattered their certainty, and claimed their attention without asking for it. He could see the beginnings of unrest in their eyes, questions they dared not voice but which pulsed behind every stolen glance. Could she be better than them? Could she be better than him? He refused to allow that thought to breathe. "Reset the field," Briggs barked. His tone was sharp, commanding, snapping his men back into motion. They obeyed quickly, dragging out heavier dummies, loading them with armor plates, and programming the automated tracks that made them move unpredictably. These weren't wooden cutouts or swinging boards. These dummies were designed to simulate hostile combatants, moving erratically, weaving in and out of cover, firing back with harmless but disorienting paint rounds. Many recruits left this course bruised, shaken, and humbled. "This isn't a game anymore," Briggs growled as the woman adjusted the sling of her rifle. "If you think you can waltz in here and embarrass my team, then you'll face what they face in training. Real simulations. Hostiles moving, returning fire, pressure that doesn't stop. You've shown you can hit a target. Now we'll see if you can survive." The men exchanged uneasy looks. They had all run this gauntlet themselves and most of them had failed their first tries. The thought of watching her attempt it, and possibly succeed, gnawed at them. But none dared question Briggs aloud. The woman simply nodded, her eyes calm, her voice steady. "I said I don't miss." The course roared to life. Mechanical motors whined as armored dummies sprang forward, darting from one barricade to another with jerky, unpredictable movements. Paint rounds snapped through the air, bright streaks smacking into walls and dirt, leaving angry splashes where a real bullet would have killed. The first dummy popped out from behind cover, muzzle flashing. Crack. Her bullet punched through its chest plate, dropping it instantly. Another rushed her from the side. Without hesitation she pivoted, exhaled, fired. Down. The course didn't relent. Two more dummies appeared at once, one sprinting, one ducking behind cover. She moved like water, shifting seamlessly between targets. Crack, crack. Both fell before they could fire a second shot. Paint rounds hissed around her, some close enough to sting as they whipped past, but she didn't flinch. She didn't scramble for cover the way the SEALs did when they first ran the course. She stood tall, moving only as much as she needed, conserving energy, her rifle an extension of her will. Every squeeze of the trigger was decisive. The men watching began to murmur, their disbelief deepening with every shot. She wasn't just surviving, she was dominating. Briggs clenched his jaw, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen men fold under this pressure, seen them crawl through the dirt, desperate just to make it to the end. Yet here she was, serene as a mountain lake, dropping targets with surgical precision while chaos exploded around her. One final wave of dummies stormed out, programmed to overwhelm her with numbers. For at once, weaving, firing, advancing. The SEALs leaned forward, certain this would finally break her rhythm. But it didn't. Crack, 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 crack. 4 shots. 4 kills. The course fell silent, the machines powering down one by one until only the hiss of desert wind remained. Smoke curled lazily from the barrel of her rifle. Her breathing was steady, her posture unchanged. She had cleared the entire gauntlet, something even Briggs himself had struggled with the first time he ran it. The men stared, some wide-eyed, some shaking their heads, some with expressions that bordered on awe. One muttered under his breath, "That's impossible." Briggs' chest burned with fury, but he forced his face into a mask of control. Losing composure now would only confirm what his men were already beginning to suspect, that this woman had outshone them all. "Enough," he snapped, his voice sharp, cutting through the whispers. "She's proven her aim. Fine. But combat isn't just about shooting. It's about endurance. It's about strength. It's about surviving what would break others." He turned to the woman, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're special because you can pull a trigger? Then you'll prove yourself the way warriors do. Up close, no distance, no hiding. Man against man. Let's see how you fare when the target can strike back." The men stiffened. They knew what he was implying. A sparring match. Not against one of them, against him. Commander Briggs, built like stone, forged by decades of training, feared and respected as much for his fists as his command. He was daring her into a fight he believed no civilian woman could win. The woman regarded him in silence for a moment. Then, slowly she set the rifle down on the bench, its metallic clink final, deliberate. She stepped forward, her eyes meeting his with quiet resolve. "I didn't come here to fight you," she said calmly. "You don't have a choice," Briggs snapped, his pride a beast that could no longer be contained. "Unless you're afraid." For the first time, a shadow of a smile crossed her lips. "Afraid?" I just don't see the point. She stepped closer, her voice dropping so only he and the men nearest could hear. But if you insist. The SEAL's breath caught. The woman had just accepted. Briggs squared his shoulders, towering over her, his muscles coiled, his pride desperate to reclaim what the rifle had stolen. He wanted to humiliate her, to remind his men that no matter how precise her shots were, she could never stand as their equal in hand-to-hand combat. But in the back of his mind, an uneasy thought lingered. What if she could? The men formed a loose circle around the sparring mat, their boots crunching against the gravel as they closed in. The air was heavy with anticipation, thicker than gun smoke, every breath laced with the unspoken thrill of witnessing something forbidden. A commander risking his authority in a fight he never should have agreed to. Briggs shrugged off his jacket, the muscles in his arms flexing, his body radiating the confidence of a man who had dominated every sparring match of his career. He cracked his knuckles deliberately, each pop like a warning. The woman, in contrast, made no show of preparation. She didn't stretch, didn't pace, didn't roll her shoulders the way fighters did before stepping into combat. She simply stood with her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged, her posture calm. If the heat of the desert or the weight of 24 skeptical eyes pressed on her, she showed no sign. That quietness unsettled the men more than any aggressive stance would have. You asked for this, Briggs growled, stepping onto the mat. Remember that when you're on the ground. I didn't ask, she corrected softly, stepping forward as well. You did. The men exchanged glances. Briggs' jaw clenched. The sting of her words cut deeper than he expected. He lunged first, closing the gap in a flash. His fists moved like pistons, aiming for her ribs, her jaw, her temple. He fought with the speed of a man trained to overwhelm before his opponent could even think. But she wasn't there. She moved with deceptive ease, slipping aside as though she knew his attacks before they landed. Her body swayed like reeds bending in the wind, never rigid, never forced, always flowing. Briggs' fist cut through empty air, his elbow grazing only her sleeve. He snarled and swung again, a hammering hook meant to take her head off. She ducked, so smoothly it looked effortless, her braid whipping behind her as his knuckles found nothing but the dry heat. Stand still, he barked, his frustration bleeding through. Her voice was calm, almost patient. Why would I? The men watching could hardly believe it. They had seen Briggs dismantle opponents twice his size, men who trained daily to withstand punishment. But every strike he threw seemed wasted, and the woman hadn't so much as lifted her hands in retaliation. She wasn't fighting him, not yet. She was reading him. Briggs realized it too late. His fury drove him harder, his muscles straining, sweat breaking across his forehead as he pressed forward with raw aggression. But aggression without precision was nothing against her. She sidestepped, pivoted, let his momentum carry him past. He swung again, and every time she was just beyond reach, as though she knew exactly where his fists would land. Finally, with a roar, he threw a heavy right aimed at her chest, putting the full weight of his body behind it. This time she didn't dodge. She moved into him. Her hand shot out, snapping against his wrist with surgical accuracy, redirecting the force just enough to send his arm wide. In the same breath, her shoulder turned, her other hand clamping down on his elbow. The motion was fluid, precise, and devastating. Crack. The sound was unmistakable, the sickening pop of a joint being pushed beyond its limit. Briggs howled, dropping to one knee, his face contorted with rage and pain as his arm hung useless at his side. The men froze. Not a sound escaped them. What they had just witnessed was impossible. Their commander, a man carved from stone, brought down in seconds by a woman who hadn't even broken a sweat. She stepped back, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady. I told you, she said softly. I don't miss. The words echoed in the silence, a calm declaration more brutal than any scream. Briggs tried to rise, but the pain in his arm betrayed him, forcing him back down. He glared up at her, his pride shattered along with his joint, fury burning hotter than the desert sun. Yet beneath that fury, a sliver of something darker lingered, fear. The men looked at each other, uncertain. The chain of command had just been fractured in front of their eyes. They had seen their commander fall, and they had seen who had broken him. Respect shifted in that instant, a tide turning silently but irreversibly. One SEAL stepped forward, his voice trembling with awe. How did you do that? The woman looked at him, then at the rest of them. Her eyes were calm, steady, carrying no boast, no arrogance. I learned the same way I learned to shoot, she said. When you don't have power, you learn how to use what you do have. Force against force is waste. But weakness against arrogance? That's survival. Her words hit harder than her strike had. The men, hardened as they were, felt something shift inside them. She hadn't come here for recognition or glory, or to humiliate anyone. She had simply demonstrated truth, unshakable, undeniable truth. Briggs, clutching his arm, spat into the dirt. "This isn't over," he growled. Her gaze lingered on him, unwavering. "It was never a competition," she said. Then she stepped away, leaving the circle, leaving the silence, leaving a group of elite soldiers staring at one another with the realization that the world they thought they understood had just tilted on its axis. The circle of men broke slowly, uneasily, like a tide that didn't quite know where to flow. Some of them lingered in silence, their faces taut with disbelief. Others whispered in low voices as though afraid the desert itself might overhear their doubts. Commander Briggs remained on the ground, cradling his injured arm, his pride shattered more violently than his joint. His men had never seen him brought low before. In their minds he was untouchable, a figure of stone and steel. Yet one woman, calm, quiet, unassuming, had toppled him as easily as snapping a twig. No one dared speak too loudly, but their eyes betrayed them. They looked at her with something new, something dangerous for Briggs: respect. Not the automatic respect drilled into them by rank and chain of command, but the kind that had to be earned, the kind no medal or insignia could demand. She had done the impossible 3 times over, and none of them could deny it. Briggs pushed himself upright, his face pale with pain but burning with anger. "Get back to training," he barked, his voice hoarse. "Now." The men hesitated, torn between instinct to obey and the unspoken pull of the woman who had just rewritten the rules before their eyes. For the first time, Briggs' command didn't carry the same absolute weight. One by one, reluctantly, they moved back toward their stations, but their heads turned, their eyes lingering on her as they went. She stood quietly at the edge of the mat, watching. She hadn't celebrated her victory, hadn't gloated, hadn't so much as smiled. She simply existed, calm and steady, as though she'd done nothing extraordinary. That calmness unnerved Briggs more than anything else. It robbed him of any ground to attack her on. "You think this proves something?" he growled, staggering to his feet. "You think one shot, one course, one broken arm changes who we are? These men are SEALs. They've bled, they've killed, they've stared death in the eye. You don't belong here." Her gaze didn't waver. "I didn't come here to belong," she said. "I came because you said no one could. And I don't miss." The words cut through the air like a blade. Briggs clenched his teeth, but before he could fire back, one of his men spoke up, hesitant but firm enough to be heard. "Sir. With respect, she's done everything you said she couldn't." All eyes turned. The man who had spoken looked nervous, his shoulders stiff, but he didn't back down. Another SEAL nodded in agreement. Then another. Their voices were quiet, respectful, but the message was undeniable. They had seen her do what none of them could, and their loyalty to truth outweighed their loyalty to pride. Briggs' jaw tightened. He could feel his grip slipping, not just on the situation but on the very men he commanded. Authority could demand obedience, but it couldn't demand belief, and belief was shifting. The woman didn't press the moment. She simply turned, picked up her rifle from where she had left it, and slung it over her shoulder. Her calmness carried the weight of finality, as though nothing more needed to be proven. She started walking toward the desert horizon, her braids swaying gently behind her. One of the younger SEALs called out, his voice tinged with awe. "Wait, what's your name?" She paused, her back to them, the desert wind tugging at her clothes. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then quietly, without turning, she said, "Names don't matter. Only what you can do." And then she kept walking. The men stood frozen, watching her silhouette grow smaller against the glare of the sun. Briggs glared at their faces, saw the reflection of admiration in their eyes, and felt his stomach twist with fury. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She wasn't supposed to walk away with their respect. He was their commander. This was his range, his authority. But no amount of fury could erase what they had seen with their own eyes. Her unshakable calm, her perfect shots, her domination of the course, and the ease with which she had broken him. The truth would linger long after she was gone. Briggs barked at his men to resume drills, to focus, to forget. But their movements lacked conviction. Their shots rang hollow. They weren't forgetting. They wouldn't forget. As the sun dipped lower, painting the desert in long shadows, Briggs stood apart, clutching his injured arm, his pride bleeding silently. Around him, his men trained half-heartedly, their minds elsewhere. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the woman walked steadily, her figure swallowed by the endless stretch of sand. She hadn't asked for their respect. She hadn't even wanted it. But she had earned it, the kind of respect no title could command. And though Briggs tried to bury it beneath orders and fury, he knew the truth as surely as the men did. She had proved him wrong. Night descended over the desert like a curtain of velvet, stars pricking the sky in sharp, cold clarity. The training range lay quiet, the machines powered down, the targets reset for tomorrow's drills. The men sat in clusters around their tents and trucks, their conversations low and cautious, their laughter forced. Normally, after a day of training, the camp buzzed with energy, stories traded, jokes cracked, rivalries stoked. But tonight was different. Tonight, silence hung heavier than the heat. Every man's mind circled the same memory, the woman's shots echoing across the range, the way she dismantled the gauntlet without breaking stride, and most vividly of all, the moment she'd broken their commander's arm as though it were nothing more than brittle wood. Some tried to convince themselves it had been luck. Others muttered excuses about her having some kind of background they didn't know about. But deep down they all knew the truth, what she had done was beyond luck, beyond excuse. Briggs sat alone in his tent, his injured arm bound tightly in a sling. The medic had done what he could, but the pain was a constant, gnawing reminder of his humiliation. He replayed the fight over and over, seeing her calm face, hearing her steady words. "I don't miss." Those 3 words stabbed deeper than the pain in his joint. His men had seen him broken, and worse, they had seen her as stronger than him. That wound to his pride was one no bandage could fix. He slammed his good fist onto the table, rattling a canteen and scattering maps. He couldn't let this stand. If word spread beyond the camp, if other units learned that Commander Briggs had been humiliated by a civilian woman, his reputation would collapse. His authority would crumble. And authority, he knew, was the only thing that kept chaos at bay. She had to be discredited. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He could order his men to forget, but soldiers weren't machines. They remembered, they whispered, they told stories. He could frame her as a fraud, claim she had cheated somehow, but too many eyes had seen her shoot, too many ears had heard the targets fall. Lies wouldn't hold. That left only one option. If she returned, and Briggs was certain she would because people like her couldn't resist proving themselves again, he would set a trap. A challenge designed not to test her but to break her. Something no one could walk away from unscathed. Then when she fell, his men would see her as human again. Weak. Ordinary. Outside, around the fire, the men whispered her name though they didn't know it. They speculated about her past, about where she'd learned to fight, to shoot, to move like she did. One of the younger SEALs shook his head, his voice hushed. "I've never seen anything like it." She was calm. Like nothing could touch her. Another, older and more cynical, scoffed. "Calm doesn't win wars. She's a trick. A distraction. You'll see." But even as he said it, he knew he didn't believe his own words. None of them did. Far beyond the camp, under the same star-filled sky, the woman walked a quiet trail through the desert, her rifle slung over her back, her steps steady and unhurried. She hadn't come for recognition, hadn't stayed for praise. She had no interest in glory. But she had felt their doubt like a weight, and she had lifted it not for herself but because truth demanded it. Her life had been built on survival, on doing what others called impossible, and to her this had been no different. She thought little of Briggs as she moved through the sand. Men like him were common, loud, prideful, convinced of their invincibility until the world reminded them otherwise. She hadn't set out to humiliate him. But she had shown him the truth, and what he chose to do with it was his burden, not hers. Back at camp, Briggs' men slowly drifted to their bunks, but sleep did not come easily. Some dreamed of her rifle crack, others of the way she had turned Briggs' strength against him. They woke restless, their faith shaken, their loyalties uncertain. Briggs lay awake long into the night, staring at the canvas ceiling of his tent, his mind a storm of rage and fear. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he would rebuild what she had broken. Tomorrow he would remind his men who their commander was. And if she returned, if she dared set foot on his range again, he would make sure she never walked away with their respect. The stars wheeled silently overhead, indifferent to human pride and pain. And somewhere in the vast desert, a simple woman moved onward, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that her quiet defiance had already become a story whispered around fires, a legend growing with each telling. The sun rose blood-red over the desert the next morning, stretching long shadows across the sand and painting the training grounds in unforgiving light. The men lined up stiffly, their rifles in hand, their eyes heavy from a restless night. They obeyed orders, but their movements lacked conviction, their salutes fell flat. Commander Briggs noticed every hesitation, every sideways glance, and it churned his fury deeper. His arm throbbed in its sling, but the pain was nothing compared to the wound in his pride. He had spent the night planning, sharpening the edges of his revenge. "Listen up," he barked, his voice loud enough to cut through the morning silence. "Today we push harder. Harder than you've ever gone before. No excuses. No breaks. If you want to wear the trident, you earn it." The men responded with a muted "Yes, sir," but their voices lacked the fire he wanted. He clenched his jaw. Their belief was fractured and he knew why. He needed to crush the ghost of the woman from yesterday. He needed to bury her memory under sweat, sand, and fear. Hours passed under the punishing sun. The men ran drills until their legs shook, dove into sand pits until their throats filled with grit, and shot round after round until their hands blistered. Briggs drove them harder than ever, his commands sharp, relentless. But still, the woman lingered in their minds, an unshakable echo. And then, as the heat shimmered off the range, someone spotted her. She was walking calmly down the ridge, her rifle slung casually across her shoulder, her steps steady as though the desert itself welcomed her. The men froze, their exhaustion forgotten, their eyes fixed on her figure. She hadn't vanished into legend after all. She had returned. Briggs' stomach twisted, but outwardly he straightened, forcing a sneer onto his face. Well, the ghost comes back to haunt us." His voice carried mockery, but his heart pounded. This was his chance. His trap was ready. She stopped at the edge of the training field, her calm gaze sweeping over the men, then settling on Briggs. "You said no one could. I proved you wrong. What more do you want?" Briggs stepped forward, his sling visible but ignored. "I want the truth exposed," he snapped. "Yesterday was luck. Smoke and mirrors. Today you face a real challenge." He gestured to a structure behind him, an improvised course of steel and sandbags, targets rigged at impossible angles, moving parts designed to disorient, obstacles sharp enough to injure if handled carelessly. It was a gauntlet meant not for training but for humiliation. He had built it in the early hours, twisting the range into a weapon. "No one can clear that," one of the younger SEALs muttered under his breath. Briggs heard and smiled coldly. "Exactly. Let her try. When she fails, you'll all remember who commands this ground." The woman studied the course for a long moment, then slowly set her rifle on the ground. She pulled her braid tighter, adjusted her stance, and without a word, stepped forward. The men held their breath. The first target swung suddenly, almost mockingly. She moved like water, ducking, pivoting, striking with speed and precision. Her hand snapped a blade Briggs hadn't seen her carry before, slicing the rope cleanly, sending the target crashing to the sand. Gasps rose from the men. She moved onward, scaling a jagged wall that cut hands raw. She climbed without hesitation, her fingers finding holds invisible to the untrained eye. She dropped into a pit, rolled through the sand, and emerged shooting. Each target fell with perfect rhythm, her shots echoing like thunder. The course fought back with every trick Briggs had engineered, but she flowed through it with an ease that defied explanation. Where others would have stumbled, she danced. Where others would have broken, she adapted. Minutes stretched like hours. The men forgot to breathe. Even Briggs, his face hard, could not deny what his eyes were witnessing. At last, she reached the final stretch, a moving target designed to blur against the sun, nearly invisible to the human eye. Briggs had said it knowing no man under his command had ever landed a hit. It was the keystone of his trap. If she missed, he could finally dismiss her. She dropped into a kneel, her body perfectly still. The desert wind shifted, dust rising in a faint spiral. She exhaled once, slowly, and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked across the range. The target dropped. Silence consumed the camp. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, the SEALs began to clap, hesitant at first, then louder, until the sound rolled like thunder through the desert. Their faces lit not with mockery but with awe, with genuine respect. Briggs stood rigid, his face pale, his throat tight. His trap had failed. The woman had not only cleared it, she had owned it, turned it into her stage. His men weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. She lowered her rifle, her expression calm as always. "I told you," she said softly. "I don't miss." With that, she turned and began to walk away, her figure shrinking once more into the endless desert. The men stood in stunned silence, their respect following her like a shadow. Briggs' fists clenched at his sides, but he could do nothing. She had proven herself beyond question, beyond rank, beyond pride. The story would spread, carried on the lips of every man who had seen it. And long after the desert wind erased her footprints, her legend would remain, Of the simple woman who had done the impossible, who had silenced the scoff of a SEAL officer and proved once and for all that she never missed.
The end.